Greetings, you gorgeous garden gnomes. It is the end of our main growing season here in the backyard farm in Lindsay, Ontario, Agricultural Zone 5. And it is actually the perfect time to start thinking about next year. So before you get caught up in maybe building your raised beds or planning where you're going to plant everything next year, or getting into all those seed catalogs, the first thing that I always recommend is to start thinking about your compost. There are many different ways to compost. There's cold and hot composting, vermicomposting, bokashi, fermentation, and so many others. There are also just as many systems and devices available that can help you to compost better. The simplest form of composting would be to gather all of your compost materials into a large pile, probably off in the corner of your property somewhere, out of sight and out of mind, to just cold compost and break down naturally as they would in nature. However, for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute, that might not be the best option. You could build a bay system similar to what we have here, but there are also composters available for purchase through hardware stores and your local municipalities, such as the tumblers or the black compost bins. Before you decide on a compost system, consider how much time, energy, effort, and money you have to commit to a compost system. To build a successful and high quality compost system, regardless of the methods that you use, we want to think like livestock farmers. Because inside of our compost, there is or should be a thriving ecosystem. In fact, in 1 tablespoon of compost, there are more life forms than there are humans on Earth. Just like other forms of livestock, horses, cows, pigs, chickens, the life forms in our compost need the same things to thrive. They need food, water, air, and shelter. The food that these creatures eat are the carbon and nitrogen-rich materials that come from our gardens or yards and kitchens. Carbon sources, typically called browns, are things like dried leaves, straw, and wood chips. Nitrogen sources, often called greens, include fresh grass clippings and leaves, kitchen scraps, coffee grinds, and whole plants. Fall is a great time to start thinking about how you're going to compost, as a lot of the materials for carbon and nitrogen are readily available. The leaves are falling off of the trees, and we're collecting the green materials off of our garden beds. But how much of those carbon and nitrogen rich sources do you need to collect to create a good compost system? There is a general rule of 30-to-1 carbon sources and nitrogen sources. Now, you can get really deep into the science of composting and weigh all of the materials that you have and find out how much of carbon and nitrogen each material has before you add it to your compost system. But that is a little bit too much work for me and our compost system. So what I usually do is 50% carbon to 50% nitrogen, or 50% browns to 50% greens, since we're not actually measuring the carbon and nitrogen in each item. What I like to do is half and half browns to greens. So we don't have to measure the weights of any of the materials going into the compost. We'll just do it half by eye, and we'll layer the browns with the greens in 4 to 6 inch thick layers. So we've covered the food for the life forms that are going to do a lot of the breaking down of our compost material. The next component is water. Now, the life forms that are living inside of your compost system are actually mostly aquatic rather than terrestrial. So they need water to help them move around to different parts of the compost and find new sources of food. Though our little compost friends need water to move around and to reproduce, having too much from either us adding the water in or from being exposed to the elements and having a lot of rain on top of them, that will actually end up suffocating them, pushing all the oxygen and air out of the compost system, which will turn it anaerobic. We want to have lots of air in the compost system to provide that oxygen so that it stays aerobic, so with oxygen, and promotes the beneficial bacteria that are going to get our compost system hot and break down the material faster. If we add too much water and we push all that air out and it starts to go anaerobic, then the compost system can start to smell. And since we live in town, we have neighbors that we want to keep happy. To add air into your compost, the most practical option is to manually turn it. So you can do this with a shovel or with a pitchfork, or you can even get an auger to do this. The frequency of which you turn your compost pile is really up to you and how much time you have. Some will recommend daily turning, some weekly, others bi-weekly. What we do is measure the temperature of our compost pile with a little thermometer, and once it has gotten to the hot section and cooled back down to the active section, then we'll turn the pile. This typically takes 4 to 7 days. If composting happens naturally outdoors, why do we need to provide a shelter? Well, for us, the shelter is to prevent one main thing, and that is the overwatering of our compost. So we already mentioned about how excessive water will push out the air. However, excessive water will also wash away the water-soluble nutrients from our compost. And then when we go to put it onto our beds, it is of lesser quality. The first step in building your compost is to collect your materials. For our piles, this includes our kitchen scraps, leaves, green yard waste, coffee grinds, and wood chips. Any materials that are bulky should be shredded. Here I'm shredding up some raspberry canes. This will help to increase the surface area of the material and help to support more life in the compost. The second step is to assemble the compost in layers, roughly 4 to 6 inches thick, alternating between brown layers and green layers. I like to start the pile with a layer of wood chips on the bottom. I think this helps to absorb extra moisture, and as the pile heats up and loses moisture, it can draw from that reserve at the bottom. The final step is to water in the compost. This can be done between each layer or at the end. I don't think that it makes that much difference. I prefer a hot compost system for 3 main reasons. 1, it's faster than cold composting. 2, it may kill bad bacteria and weed seeds. And it's just a lot of fun seeing how hot I can get it. So this is actually a fairly easy and simple compost system to set up and is known as a leaf tower. So it definitely requires less materials and time to set up. What we need is a lot of leaves, and we're going to do something a little bit different than what other people do. Since we have a lot of carbon rich material here, we're going to add in a lot of coffee grounds that we get from a local coffee shop to help speed up the decomposition. So one benefit of a leaf tower like this is that it provides a lot more room for airflow. We have a large mesh wire wall rather than our closed uh, wall for our main compost system. So a lot more air is going to get into this. So we don't actually need to turn this like we will need to turn our other hot compost. For this system, we're going to follow a similar setup to our main hot compost base system, where we have a layer of browns and then we're going to shovel in a layer of coffee grinds. So we'll continue to do that until we fill up the system. So in conclusion, deciding on a compost system to use is really up to you and your budget, your time, how much space you have, and how much energy you have. We utilize a couple of different methods here. We have one that costs a little bit more money and also requires more time and energy. We also have one that was very easy to set up, didn't cost a lot of money. We repurposed a lot of material that we have and won't require further time once it's all set up. Thank you so much, Garden Gnomes, for watching this video on how we compost here at the Backyard Farm. If you liked the video, please leave a like and maybe consider subscribing so that you can stay up to date on when we put out new videos. I hope that you learned a little bit, and I hope that I inspired you to start your own compost system at home so that you can utilize all those kitchen scraps and garden scraps that you have and make a better garden next year. I really appreciate you coming out and watching and interacting with these videos. So please keep that up, and I'll see you in the next one.